What's up, guys? I have another pen video for you. Today, kind of just, it's more of a show and tell, not really like a review or an unboxing or anything. But here's the pen. Not sure how well you'll be able to make it out. But it's Waterman 92, and I think the color is a quartz gray with red specks in it. This pen, I believe, was made in like the 1920s to 1930s. So basically it's a vintage pen. I'm not really all that familiar with vintage pens. I have wanted one kind of as one of the pens on my bucket list of pens to get. And what's special at this pen is that it actually has a flexible nib on it. It has one of the you probably won't be able to make it out, but it has a Waterman number 2 size nib, which is actually quite flexible. I believe this person who restored this pen and sold it to me said that it would go from a fine line width to a triple broad. My impressions of this pen is, considering this pen is probably at least 80 years old, it's actually in pretty good condition. You can see it's a lever filler here. So inside there's a sack with, I believe, a bar, and then when you lift up this lever, it pushes against that bar, compressing the sack, and then once you flip the lever back over into the pen, it draws ink in, through vacuum from the sack uncompressing. That's not really probably not really a word, but yeah. I don't know. This pen, considering how old it is, it's like I said, it's in great condition. When I bought it, there was some chipping in the cap here, right here. I believe you can see the shine of the light, and there's a dead spot here in that beveled section of the cap. But other than that, I don't know, it looks really good. The gold plating on it, on this band, on the clip, still looks to be in pretty good condition. I can't really see much brassing other than maybe here, but I'm not sure if that was ever really gold plated. I haven't really gone over and inspected this pen underneath a loop or anything. I've just been basically writing with it. So yeah, in this video I'm also going to discuss, I guess, the difference between modern flex pens and vintage flex pens. I don't really have a lot of experience with flex pens. And basically, my experience with flex pens boils down to Noodler's pens. Here's a Noodler's Nib Creeper in demonstration clear. And from what I've learned, there really aren't really a lot of pen manufacturers that are making pens that have flexible nibs. The one that's brought up most often is Namiki or Pilot. They have their Falcon nib, which I think is called something else in the Japanese market, but they also have they call it the FA nib. Yeah, it's a FA nib. That's their flexible nib, and then they also make the Falcon, which is a pen with its own specific nib that's actually somewhat flexible. So whenever you go on forums and stuff and you ask about flexible nib pens, that's generally what most people will refer to as the modern day flex pen. But from what I've seen, Namiki Pilot doesn't actually advertise it as a flex pen. Rather, it's just a pen that has very soft writing features, so it's kind of like writing with a brush. Before I get too much into details about it, for those of you who don't know what a flex nib is, it's basically a nib that can change the line width based on how much pressure you put down on. So with this, if I go side strokes across, you can see it's actually very thin lines, and the way this nib was ground, it's actually a little stubbish. So you can actually get some line variation. I'm not putting any downward pressure on it, so horizontal strokes are like that, and vertical strokes are just a hair thicker. And then as I put more pressure down onto the nib, the line width increases. because this is a vintage flex pen, it is possible that, and actually with any nib, if you put too much downward pressure on, you'll spring the nib. And basically what that means is that the tines of the nib will bend upwards and then they won't spring back down. You can actually see that right now the tines are at a slight like bentward shape downwards. If you spring your nib, the tines end up coming up and you end up having ink flow issues because obviously it loses its capillary actions. The way the Noodler's pens do it is that it has a stainless steel nib versus that nib, which has a 14 karat gold nib on it. But the line, this tine slit, extends all the way down into the section of the pen, all the way into the feed. I have to excuse my neighbors and their motorcycle. Anyway, oh my god, that thing's loud. Anyway, so that allows basically for the two halves of the nib to spread out more. So you get the same thing where when you go with horizontal lines, you have a very thin line. This one is more of like a rounded ball nib to it, so you don't really get that much line variation without pressure. But like before, you can start putting some downward pressure onto it, and then you can really get nice thick lines. The only problem with the Noodler's pens is that because they're a steel nib and the way it's designed, it actually takes a lot of downward pressure. So you can see here, like if I flex to its maximum capabilities, and also like the Noodler's pens kind of have like a flow issues where you'll end up getting railroading a lot more. With the Waterman 92, I haven't gotten railroading yet, but you can see like, oh, there we go. When I'm pushing down on the paper, I can actually feel the two halves of the nib, the tines, like really scraping up against the paper. But that's the downward pressure that's required for me to get this kind of line width. Versus if I were to go to the Waterman, it actually doesn't require anywhere near as much pressure. If I use the same pressure as I did for here, you can see here, like, it's just a little bit smoother, doesn't really require as much downward pressure to get that line width as the steel nib did. And that's the main difference between modern flex nibs and vintage flex nibs. And actually the nibs that are most sought after are called wet noodles, where basically those require almost no downward pressure to get really broad strokes in the writing. I don't really believe this is a wet noodle. It's a little subjective to what you consider a wet noodle. It still requires a little more pressure than I expected. One thing actually about this pen was that the responsiveness of it wasn't as good as I would have liked. Where basically the responsiveness is how quickly the nib can close back together and give you a very hair thin line. So generally if you start doing here, you should be able to do no pressure. And you can see here that I'm not sure whether it's just the responsiveness, or how wet the nib is. But the line doesn't really like close back up really quickly. It's still like rather broad. I don't know. It could be like a practice thing. Like I guess that's not too bad. Like I said, I just got the pen today, so it could be a little more of a practice thing. I am more used to the Noodler's pens, so I can get it to actually close up relatively easily and get like good responsiveness. But at the same time, I do have feeding issues, as you can see here. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you look over here, you can see how much thinner the line is versus over here, which is much thicker. Here, this is the thickness, and here is where I let off, and you can see here that it doesn't really close back up as quickly. Could also be I'm still pressing down a little hard with that pen, but who knows. But going back to like modern flex nibs, if you're interested in getting a pen with a flex nib, like I said, there are these Noodler's pens. The Nib Creeper is pretty cheap. It's around like $15. You get it for like maybe $13 online. There's also the Ahab and the Conrad that Noodler's make, which is a much thicker pen. It's a much bigger, larger size pen, and those run from like $20 to $40 if you get the full ebonite Conrad, I believe. In terms of the Falcon, I believe it runs for around $140. Like I said, Namiki doesn't advertise it as a flex pen, but it is like, I believe from what I've read, you can get the same type of flexiness as you can with these pens. It's just in a much nicer, more elegant package. Outside of that, I guess there are nib meisters that do custom grinds. I know John Modishaw does Spencerian grinds on certain nibs that gives you, really nice thin lines that kind of come up to much larger swells. And also Binder makes, Richard Binder, he grinds Pelican M400 nibs for flex writing. I think he also does nibs for Edison, Gate City Pens, and Bexley. But of course, when you go to Nibmeister route and you get a custom ground nib, that does cost quite a bit. I'm pretty sure from what I remember, Binder's M400 nibs for Pelicans cost, I think, $215, and that's just the nib and the section alone. But you do have to consider that you are buying a 14 karat gold nib, and that generally alone is like $120, and then you're paying for the service of him doing the regrind and adding flexibility to the nib. I thought about getting the Falcon, and then I thought about getting the Binder nib, but finally I decided, I saw this on the classifieds for Fountain Pen Network. The price was good. I paid $135 for this shipped, so relatively close to the price of a brand new Falcon, cheaper than the Binder nib, and overall I'm pretty happy with it. Because it is a vintage pen, I will baby it a little more. It won't be like an everyday writer pen, but it is actually nice for like letter writing and journaling. Because of how soft the nib is, I actually find it's a little difficult to write normally without having any flex in the writing. Versus with this, because of how stiff the nib is, it's actually quite easy to get the same line width when you're doing normal everyday writing. With this, I do have to, I can get it done, I just have to focus a lot more and put basically absolutely no pressure down on it. So you can see here, I can get pretty even line width here, but it's actually much nicer if I just use a little bit of finger motion instead of doing a whole hand motion. And I can so you see the line's a little thicker, but I can get much more line variation. You can see here and here on my downstroke for the Q. It's a little bit wider than it is on the upstroke, and also here on the B especially, the upstroke is much thinner because as I upstroke it's thin, and I put just a little bit of pressure down. I'm not really flexing the nib a lot, but it is enough to make it more noticeable in the writing. Versus with the Noodler's pens, you do have to put it's much easier to write quickly and get a nice even line width. And for me to actually want to do some flexiness to it, you can see my strokes just aren't smooth. In order to get smooth strokes, I have to do it slowly, and then I have to put a lot of downward pressure to get that large swell in the line. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed me showing off my new pen. That's about it. Like I said, one of the things on my bucket list of pens to get was a vintage pen. I do have a old Parker 21 that I think came from the 50s, and I recently got a Mont Blanc 146 that is from the late 70s to early 80s. So I guess you could kind of consider those vintage pens, but for this to be from the 20s to 30s, this is definitely a true vintage pen. And like I said, not all vintage pens, mind you, have flexible nibs, but this one does. Just because you find an old pen doesn't necessarily mean you can start flexing the nib. You do have to be careful about that. You may end up just destroying your pen and your nib. But I am glad to get it in my collection. I have no regrets of buying it, even though it doesn't really have the responsiveness that I would have liked. It definitely doesn't have the same responsiveness as a dip pen nib that's meant for flexing. But as a journaling pen, as a letter writing pen, I love the line variation that comes with it. I also like the feel of it. It's kind of a narrower pen. If you want to get a vintage pen that has a flexible nib that's a much larger diameter of pen, say close to the diameter of my Pelican M600, then those pens cost a lot more than the narrower pens like the Waterman 52, you know, and like the ring top pens that are meant to be carried around the neck. Those are the ones that are cheaper and that you'll find in like the $100 to $200 range, depending on the condition of the pens. Larger pens will definitely go for a lot more. You know, I've easily seen vintage pens with flexi nibs that are like this M600 size that go for like $300-400. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.